What's up, everyone? Welcome to Draft Business as usual. I am your host, Daniel Fowler, creator of DraftySports.com. And if you've seen one of our episodes before, you know that we talk about concepts that seem simple, but we dive in to see what is the amount of work that actually goes into building something. So we're not talking about draft strategy. We're not talking about player rankings. We're talking about running a business, specifically building a draft platform. If you've ever been in a bad draft experience, like on NFL.com or ESPN or Yahoo. I hear a lot of complaints about those sites specifically. Then you probably have had the dreams like, oh my gosh, I could build my own draft room. I can make it so much better. Well, I had those same thoughts, and I actually did it because I am a web developer, and so I have a certain set of skills, just like Liam Neeson. And so that's where Drafty was born, out of a desire to make a better draft room. Today we are talking about the concept of a hybrid draft. So a hybrid draft is where you enable the commissioner the ability to switch draft formats in the middle of your draft. So it's pretty complicated, but on the surface it might not seem that complicated. It's like, oh, well, the commissioner just selects a new draft format and hits go, right? And you just change the draft format and voila, magic things happen. But we're going to dive in and take a look at actually what goes in, what has to happen, the considerations we have to make to facilitate and execute that change. So if you like the content of this video, please like the video down below and subscribe to the channel. I don't ask that so that we get more followers and we expand the reach and whatever. I'm not making any money on this. But simply, I'm the kind of person that's motivated by knowing that people are actually watching the video, finding it useful, finding it interesting. Same reason I'm still running Drafty. It's not making very much money, but it exists because I just want to make a tool that I think is helpful and that I know at least a handful of other people are also using and finding good. I like for people to play with my toys. So Drafty is one of my toys. Please play with it. So yeah, if you also if you have an idea for something you'd like discussed in a future video, if you've used Drafty before or you've been in fantasy drafts for several years and you're like, I wonder what it would take to build something like that, or I have an idea for a new feature. If you have any ideas, suggestions, things that you want to know more about, drop a comment below. That way I can steer future conversations towards things that I know at least one person is finding interesting. So without further ado, why don't we dive right in? I'm going to take some notes first. So hybrid draft considerations, things that we need to think about. So when you first think about what's going to happen, we need this to be, let's see, I'm going to say commissioner only because we don't want draft participants to be able to do things. We just want the commissioner to be able to do it. I've got an AI assistant here that's suggesting some stuff. Just ignore that. What else? We need some options. So give commish some options. On this first one, I'm going to say commissioner only, but also hide from other draft participants. Okay, we're going to give the commish some options for what we're going to call phase 2, and of course the go button. We have to do the go button. So for each of these options, we're going to have to listen to changes and update the database. And then when we hear changes on the database, update the UI for other participants. And then the go button is very much the same thing. We're going to have to listen for a click. What? No, a click. No, stop, autopilot. Listen for a click and activate phase 2. Okay, so these are pretty much the biggest considerations when we actually look at our draft room. Another consideration is, where do we put this? Where do we put these options for, I almost fell out of my chair. Don't worry, I'm okay. Where do we put the options so that commissioner can switch to a phase 2 and configure their phase 2? So one place where we had this before is in the commissioner toolbox. Made sense just as we used to have the button to start phase 2 over here. And previously, commissioner had to know that he wanted a phase 2 prior to creating the draft room, and he would configure phase 2 when he was setting up his phase 1 as well. So it was this all-encompassing setup process But we've made that hopefully a little bit better by moving that into the draft room itself. And so now the commissioner has this settings panel. And if you're a draft participant, you also have the settings panel. But if you're commissioner, you can edit all of the options that are in here. And if you're a draft participant, you don't have the edit fields. You only have the ability to see what the settings are. So if we scroll down on this menu, eventually we come to, boom, the hybrid draft settings. So this is where we have stuck the options that Commissioner can configure for phase 2. And you see we have a few more options than the draft format. We have the number of rounds, the draft speed. We also have the amount of budget. If I switch this to an auction draft, we have how much budget to add, and a time limit, of course. So these options were selected because I thought about what goes into a draft room when they're creating it in the first place, and what can they change in draft. These are the options that they cannot change in the draft. And so when we tack on a phase 2, these are the options that they need to define up front so that we can build what we need to build in the creation process of that phase 2. And I call it a creation process because if you think about switching from an auction draft to a snake draft, what does a snake draft have that an auction draft does not? A draft board. That's right. And what does an auction draft have that a snake draft does not have? Lots of money. Money everywhere. Money for nominations. They have player nominations. They have the bidding mechanisms. Everything is just kind of different. On a draft board, you're just making a pick team by team. But on an auction draft, it's like all happening all at once. The bids are coming in, and the one player is on the board. Hopefully you see my visuals that I'm drawing here. But yeah, so the draft formats are very different. So like I alluded to before, we had to take all the code from, or most of the code from the draft room setup process and move it into a place where it's now in the draft room. And so no longer does the draft room just settle for controlling the mechanisms within the current draft format, but we actually have to have the code in place for all 5 of the draft formats, because at any time someone can activate the hybrid draft option and switch to another format. So hopefully we've streamlined everything so that only the code is used when it is applicable to the active draft format. And that is why in the draft room here we have a start next phase button, so that when we click that, we switch to the hybrid draft format, the phase 2 format, and it reloads the draft room. And instead of being the current format, which I think is, looks, we've got a fold button, so this is currently a poker draft format, poker auction. If we were to switch to a silent auction, it does not load, it reloads, and instead of loading the poker features, it reloads the blind bid features, or the silent features. So let's go through a few of these options. The draft format obviously just can't be changed in draft except through this hybrid draft module now. And then when considering how many rounds to run and how much budget to give each team, it became, I thought that it was simply, well, define how many rounds you want to go, and we'll switch it, and we'll just kind of start at 1 and go to 5. But no, that's not how a lot of leagues work. Same thing with the budget. If you're switching from one auction format to another auction format, most leagues I found they don't want to reset the budgets when they do that. And so instead what we're defining is how much money to add to every team when making the switch. And so you might run an auction for a little while with a $200 budget, and then towards the end you switch to another format and give everyone an extra $100. So a team that only spent $50, they have $150 left. When you switch to the new format, they now have $250 because we add $100 to their budget. From there, the commissioner can use the team settings to come in and adjust any individual team budget and team roster because we're doing the same thing with the roster spots or the rounds. So if we're switching to an auction draft, we ask how many roster spots or how many rounds is that second phase going to run, and we add that number of roster spots to each team. The reason that we do that is because if you think about running a snake draft, maybe you do a 5-round or a 2-round startup dynasty draft, and you run that draft for 2 rounds, and then you want to switch to an auction format for the remainder of the draft of the player pool. Well, originally, when building this feature, I thought that it would be best to automatically detect when the 2-round snake draft finishes, and then to automatically activate the second phase. I'm all about automating things so that the commissioner doesn't have to bother with it. But what I found is that because we have to account for all draft formats with this hybrid draft, um, what I found is that we can't always identify systemically when the first phase is finished and automatically trigger phase two because, for example, in a lot of auction drafts, leagues have decided that they do not want to enforce full rosters for teams. So in that case, we cannot detect when they're finished drafting players because a lot of teams might still have roster vacancies that have not been filled. And so the system, the draft room cannot know that, oh, that team has decided not to fill their roster, and so we can't automatically do that. So because it doesn't work um, all the time universally, we just had to take out the automated trigger for phase two, and that's why we inserted this button to start the next phase. So now the commissioner can come in whenever they are ready to start their phase two, and they can click that button. And when they click it, they do get an alert that says, "Are you sure you want to do this? Because once you go to phase two, you cannot go back to phase one." So a little bit of a safeguard there. And again, this all had to be programmed. All the text that you see, I wrote. All of the options you see, I programmed. And these editable options, like I took in the notes that we just the considerations that we just captured, there's a listener, what's called an event listener on all of these inputs, so that as soon as I change how many rounds this is going to be, it sends that to the database and saves it as a configuration so that when we activate it, that configuration is easy to pull in and just overwrite what's currently there, switching the draft mode, adding rounds to the current draft board, or creating a new draft board if we don't have one already, and and so it saves all that in the database. And on the flip side, if I'm a draft participant, if I'm not the commissioner, and I happen to be looking at this panel when the commissioner is messing with options, I will see in real time the settings get updated. So that offers a couple of different benefits, because not only is it just interesting for someone like me to be able to, maybe I joined a new league and I know that we have a phase two in the draft. I just joined this league 2 days ago, and I know that there's a phase two, but I can't remember exactly what the details are. So I could pull up that panel, look and see what the settings are, and I can mentally prepare. Oh, okay, we're going to switch to an auction draft format after only 2 rounds. That's something I need to be aware of. Also, there's some accountability. If you just happen to be in the draft room and you're about to start the draft, and maybe you're in the middle of the draft and you know phase two is about to start, you flip open this panel and you're looking at it and you say, hey, commissioner, it says here that we only have 5 rounds, but I think a couple days ago we voted to add a 6th round to our second phase. Is that right? And commissioner's like, yeah, you're totally right. I need to update that. Thanks for pointing that out. And he can go in and update that. So there's some accountability with making sure that draft participants are able to see these options. And so these are all things that have to be coded. Like, it's not just magic. It doesn't just happen. But what happens when the commissioner changes these things? Also, adding budget, that's only applicable if commissioner is switching to an auction draft. So in addition to saving this configuration to the database, we also have to listen to when this value changes. If we switch it to a snake draft, for example, we don't want to show the budget option because that would be confusing for the commissioner. And this is called just having a good user experience. If we have that option visible all the time, then it would be confusing for the commissioner because they might try to add a budget, but it's a snake draft in phase two, and so there's not a budget to use, and so it doesn't make a lot of sense. They might get confused thinking it's going to be like the Fab budget or something once they start their league, but that wouldn't make any sense because Drafty is only a draft platform. We don't actually host the league. So lots of considerations like that. You see also when I flip to snake draft, instead of a budget, you see draft speed. It's the same thing. When you do an auction draft, we don't have a slow mode for auction drafts. And so we hide that option when doing an auction draft. Now, I will say we are working on a slow auction draft format, and it's going to be really, really cool. If you follow us on Twitter or Threads now, or Facebook or Instagram, then you might have seen a screenshot a couple years ago about a slow draft format that was just knocking around in the noodle. Hopefully, we will get that launched by the end of this year. It'll be awesome. But we don't have that right now. So the draft speed is only changed when, or only shows up when you have a turn-based phase two. But I think the last thing I'm going to mention here is when we switch from live to slow. This is another extra little detail that has to be accounted for. Then you see the time limit shifts from seconds. Right here it says we're working with 30 seconds, and now to switch to the slow, that says hours. So that's another important consideration, because um, we have to change the format of how the time limit is interpreted for the system, depending on the speed of the draft. In a slow draft format, you can have a timer up to 24 hours, but in a live format, you can only put it up to 5 minutes. And so, yeah, we just have to interpret it differently. And so when we click Start Next Phase, that's something else that has to be programmed. We just have to recognize, hey, we were currently in a live draft situation here in the phase one, but now we're switching to a slow snake draft because just because, for whatever reason. And so the system has to interpret that time limit differently. And so all of this, as you might imagine, just makes for what seems like a pretty simple concept turns into a really complex concept. And the very last thing I will mention, I know I said the last thing was the last thing, is that what do we do once phase two has been activated? Well, I will show you. So when we click on next phase and it's warning me, are you sure you want to do that? You can't go back. I'm like, yeah, totally. This happens. So we programmed an alert showing, this shows for every draft participant saying, hey, the core settings of this draft room have been changed. You need to refresh the browser. And that's because we just switched to a snake draft format from an auction draft format. So we had to build a whole draft board behind the scenes. And the interface could update in real time, but there's already so many things going on in this auction draft room that we just want this blanket, we want to turn everything off, and we want to turn only the snake draft features on. So as a result, we require that participants reload the draft room just to make sure everything resets. And then in the panel, as you see that happened in real time, what you now see, I am still the commissioner of this room, but I can no longer edit these hybrid options because, again, user experience, that would be confusing. It's like I've already activated phase two. Maybe I didn't configure something right. Maybe someone just now realizes, hey, we only have 5 rounds, not 6. Well, I'm sorry, commissioners, but like you should have configured it correctly in the first place, because it's not easy to just add another round to your draft mid-draft. So instead of being able to edit the fields knowing that they can't save it, that would be confusing and that would be a bad user experience. And so we have to take the editing capability away for Commissioner. And so we're doing that by just having a simple toggle behind the scenes in the database for the hybrid draft. We call it used. Phase 2 has been used. The hybrid draft add-on has been used. And so when that is triggered as true, then we no longer show the editing fields for Commissioner. All right, the third last thing I'm going to mention, since I keep saying that it's the last thing and it's not, is that to enable the hybrid draft, not every league uses a hybrid draft system. In fact, very few do. This is a lot of time I put in to build this for only a handful of leagues, but whatever. And so just like the branding add-on that you see here, it has a try it button. Depending on, again, something that it's an if scenario. If it's a mock draft, we put up a try it button because it activates the options immediately. But if it's a paid draft room, we have a buy now button because these are premium add-ons. And so we do need to send the user to a checkout where they can pay and then come back to the draft room. So if it's a mock draft, the try it button has a listener so that whenever it's clicked, the format it automatically takes. Just like you just saw, I clicked on hybrid draft and it automatically switched to the new thing. Well, the same thing for the try it button. If you activate the add-on, then it automatically activates it. But in a paid draft room, it sends you to checkout and sends you back before it actually activates. And so, man, like the complexity of having all of these nuances depending on the draft format and the draft tier and the draft speed and the nomination format and the time limit and the are you a commissioner or are you a participant, and let's make sure we hide these options instead of showing them to you. So it's all just really, really, really when a lot of this you don't even think about until you start building it. In an earlier episode, one of the things I said is that Drafty I thought was probably like a couple hundred hours for the project to build a new draft room. Well, I was right. I spent a couple hundred hours building Drafty initially, like from scratch. But that first iteration of the draft room was terrible. It was awful. Um, it was slow. It was buggy. It was just wrong in so many ways. And so after spending more like 3 or 4 thousand hours, it finally got to a place where a lot of these nuances and what if scenarios were accounted for, that they have to be accounted for. Like as a internet user, we're used to using Facebook, Instagram, Google, YouTube, all of these websites from these billion-dollar companies who have built these really convenient apps to use. Chick-fil-A has a fantastic app. If we were to turn Drafty into an app, I would strive to make it as user-friendly as something like the Chick-fil-A app. But the reality is, I don't have the budget that Chick-fil-A has. I don't have the budget that Google has to make YouTube really convenient to use. Um, and so think about that next time you're on a small business website. It's like, okay, this might be a subpar experience, but they don't have the money to pay a team of a dozen or 100 developers to make an experience really, really good. So just keep that in mind. It's a lot of work, and so for a small company, especially a local company, it's very, very, very difficult to do. So maybe extend some grace next time you're on a website and you feel like it's not very good. So I think that wraps up our discussion of hybrid draft for today. Let me move that cursor off my face. Um, Hopefully you enjoyed it. Again, if you did, and if you are going through a mock draft today and you're curious about how something works, leave a comment on the video, and I would be glad to dive in a future episode um, so that I know someone's finding it interesting. Yeah, hopefully it won't be another 6 months before we do another episode, Draft Business as Usual. So yeah, thanks for watching. Have a good day.